Usually when we look at historical empires, there's this expectation of verticality, like a pyramid.
Right, exactly.
You open up a history textbook, and there's the king sitting at the absolute top,
Right.
The nobles and clergy forming the middle layers, and the peasants forming this massive, crushed base at the bottom.
Yeah, and the historian just points at the very tip of that pyramid and says, there is the power.
Right. Understand the king, and you understand the society.
It's a very comforting way to view history. I mean, because it's clean, it's binary.
Yeah, totally.
You have the rulers and you have the ruled.
Yeah.
We like our history to be easily categorized by dynasties or absolute monarchs, visible monuments to singular authority.
But then you step into the world of the pre-colonial Bight of Biafra in southeastern Nigeria. You look for the top of the pyramid and you find a void.
Complete void.
The pyramid is completely flat, and we're looking at a political and spiritual landscape that is like this intricate horizontal web.
It really is.
So if you are listening to this right now and you think you understand traditional power structures or rigid gender roles or even how colonized societies responded to European expansion, prepare to have your assumptions completely dismantled today.
Oh, absolutely dismantled. We are diving deep into the civilization of the Igbo people.
Yeah.
This was, and honestly still is, an incredibly dynamic, fiercely independent, and highly adaptable society.
And to really understand how they operated, we are pulling from a fascinating scholarly collection.
Right. It's called Igbo in the Atlantic World, African Origins and Diasporic Destinations.
Edited by Toyin, Falola and Raphael, Chijioke, Njoku.
Yeah, and the mission for our deep dive today is to explore how this specific society managed to bend both gender constructs and cosmic laws to survive centuries of absolute upheaval.
We are looking closely at chapters covering their political institutions, the rise of female deities, the phenomenon of male priestesses, and the gritty economic realities of gender relations.
A lot of ground to cover.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the cosmic laws and the deities, set the physical and historical scene for us. Where are we planting our feet?
Well, we need to plant our feet in the southeastern region of modern-day Nigeria. Geographically, it extends down to the Bight of Biafra.
Okay.
So you have a landscape heavily defined by its proximity to the Atlantic Ocean. Dense, lush forests and incredible agricultural richness.
Right.
But socially and historically, it is defined by a fierce, almost uncompromising rejection of absolute authority. The foundational principle of this entire civilization is captured in a single famous proverb.
Which is?
Igbo inwizai.
Translating to, Igbo has no king.
That is the literal translation. Now, imagine being an early British colonialist or Victorian missionary arriving on these shores.
Oh, boy.
You have a deeply ingrained hierarchical mindset. When you hear, "we have no king,"
Yeah.
your brain immediately translates that to,
These people live in chaos.
exactly, or this is savagery. The British spent years wandering around looking for the monarch to negotiate with, or, subjugate.
But what the source text reveals is that this wasn't chaos in the slightest.
Not at all.
It was a highly organized, diffuse, participatory democracy.
Right, power was diffuse.
So if there isn't a singular guy sitting on a throne, calling the streets, how did anything actually get done? How do you pave a road or declare a law without a centralized state?
Well, power was based on achievement, age, and oratory rather than bloodlines. You had village assemblies where literally any adult could attend and speak their mind.
Wow, any adult.
Yeah. Anthropologist Richard N. Henderson, who is cited in our sources, actually looked at this pre-colonial Igbo social system and compared it to the Eastern Mediterranean city-states of classical antiquity.
Oh, interesting comparison.
He described it as a complex unity without absolute dictators. To be a leader, you couldn't just point to your father's legacy. You had to combine wealth, personal generosity, and what they called mouth.
Mouth meaning like the literal ability to speak well.
The ability to persuade. Judith Van Allen notes in the text that influential speech wasn't just talking loudly. It was the creative and skillful use of tradition. You had to weave proverbs and history together to assure the rest of the assembly that a certain course of action was the wise and right thing to do.
So you have to constantly prove your worth.
Exactly. An individual's worth had to be proven constantly. There's another Igbo proverb that captures this beautifully. A child who washes his or her hands clean deserves to eat with his or her elders.
Man, that perfectly captures the achievement-oriented mindset. You aren't born at the adult table, but if you put in the work, no one can deny you a seat.
Exactly.
It makes me think of like a decentralized blockchain network.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, like there is no central server you can just unplug, no single king you can assassinate to crash the whole system. If you want to change the ledger, you have to negotiate with the entire network.
Right.
I imagine that made them an absolute nightmare for the British to conquer.
It made them practically indigestible for the British Empire. I mean, the standard colonial playbook was simple. Capture the king, co-opt the elites, and the rest of the body follows.
But with the Igbo, there was no single head to chop off.
Precisely. Historian Elizabeth Isake points out in the text that no Nigerian people resisted colonialism more tenaciously.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If you look at the great emirates of northern Nigeria, once the British military defeated the central ruler, the region largely fell into line.
Right, the pyramid structure.
Exactly. But the conquest of Igbo land took over 20 years of constant, grinding military action. The British would pacify one village, and the village 2 miles down the road would just say, well, we didn't surrender.
And the fight would start all over again.
Exactly.
Which brings up a story from the sources that is deeply unsettling, but it perfectly illustrates this clash of systems. The Uga crisis. Set the timeline for this. We are looking at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, right around 1898 to the early 1900s.
Yeah.
That's the era. Uga is a large, populous town in the Agwata area.
Okay.
They were known for two things: being incredibly hardworking farmers and having this pure natural water source called the Obizi Spring. And they were fighting the British tooth and nail.
They really were.
Their entire philosophy was encapsulated in a local saying, Uga anahagba osomirima ozugu hahahu.
And what does that translate to?
It translates roughly to, Uga do not run from the rain, except it drenches them.
Meaning, like, they don't retreat based on a threat. You actually have to physically overwhelm them before they give an inch.
Exactly the sentiment. They will not yield to the idea of British power. The British had to prove it in the mud.
Right.
And the British were getting deeply frustrated by this relentless, decentralized resistance. They couldn't win a decisive victory. So a British government representative decided to change tactics.
And this is where it gets really dark.
He sent an invitation to the elders and leaders of Uga, asking them to attend a peace negotiation, to discuss their grievances and find a settlement.
I want to pause here because this is where the cultural disconnect becomes fatal. We just talked about how the Igbo value mouth, the ability to speak and persuade.
Yes.
The Speech Act isn't just communication, right? It's the foundation of their entire democratic reality.
What's fascinating here is that the Speech Act is sacred. In the Igbo moral universe, an invitation to parley is protected by cosmic law.
Words have literal weight.
Words have weight. An oath is physically binding. So when the British invited them to talk, 26 of the most prominent, able-bodied Uga elders accepted the premise.
Right.
They laid down their weapons, trusting in the sanctity of the negotiation, and walked into the British camp.
And the British immediately took them captive.
And he did.
They were never seen by their families again.
Never. The sources detail how the British weaponized the Igbo's own morality against them.
That's horrifying.
The British had no culture of truth in their imperial diplomacy. To them, the invitation was just a tactical deception to remove the leadership.
Wow.
And what's terrifying is that this wasn't an isolated incident. The text mentions that the British used the exact same deception against King Chijioke of Opobo.
Who was a famous Igbo ex-slave, right?
Right, he had built this massive, independent trading empire. The British vice consul invited Chijioke onto a warship for friendly talks, explicitly promising him safe conduct.
And I'm guessing that was a lie.
The moment Chijioke stepped on deck, the ship set sail and deported him to the West Indies.
It's psychological warfare. For the Igbo, that kind of deception isn't just a dirty trick in a war.
No, it's a fundamental violation of the cosmic order. It's an abomination.
And for the town of Uga, losing those 26 elders in a single afternoon completely paralyzed the community.
The trauma was absolute. They were caught in an impossible paradox. If they fought back violently, they risked the British executing the captive elders.
Right, they had hostages.
But if they tried to negotiate further, they risked more of their leaders being kidnapped. It completely broke their ability to function.
But the way the Uga people processed this trauma over the next century is what truly stands out.
It really is.
They didn't just write a sad song or carve a memorial stone. They culturally digested the event by creating a massive annual festival to ensure the memory never, ever died.
Right, they created the Obuofo Uga Festival. The word Obuofo carries the meaning that the innocent will always go free, or that ultimate justice will prevail.
Okay.
It's invoking a kind of cosmic nemesis upon the British. Every single year, on December 26th, 26 specific masquerades emerge into the town square.
And these aren't happy masquerades.
No, these aren't celebratory spirits. They appear as discontented, mourning spirits from the underworld, physically representing the 26 lost leaders.
And the date they chose, December 26th, is brilliant from a subversive standpoint, because that is Boxing Day in the Christian calendar, the day immediately following Christmas.
A cultural overlay there is profound. As Christianity spread through the region, the Uga people took the biblical narrative and mapped their own trauma right on top of it.
How so?
Well, in the Christian story, right after the birth of Jesus, King Herod orders the slaughter of all the innocent male infants in Bethlehem to protect his throne.
Oh.
By holding the festival of the 26 kidnapped elders on Boxing Day, the Ukiga are democratizing the Christian message. They are casting the British colonialists in the role of the murderous King Herod.
And casting themselves as the innocent victims.
Exactly. The 26 masquerades are essentially Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted.
It's an incredible way to keep the grievance alive. Every single child in Uga who witnesses those 26 masquerades weeping in the square becomes a carrier of that history.
They absolutely do.
But if we pull back the lens, this intense rejection of absolute authority, this belief that nobody has the right to arbitrarily rule you, it didn't just stay in West Africa.
No, it didn't.
When you look at the sheer numbers of the transatlantic slave trade, that specific Igbo worldview was forcibly exported to the Americas on a massive scale.
The demographic data provided in the book is staggering. Over the entire period of the transatlantic trade, an estimated 1.5 million people were shipped to the Americas from the ports in the Bight of Biafra.
1.5 million.
And if you look closely at the records from the early 19th century, specifically registers kept in Sierra Leone of people rescued from slave ships, they reveal that the Igbo made up roughly 60% of the captives departing from that region.
60%. That means the cultural footprint arriving in the Americas wasn't just a random assortment of individuals.
Right.
It was a massive influx of people who fundamentally believe that Igbo has no king. You are taking people whose entire societal model is built on personal achievement and decentralized democracy, and you are trying to force them into the absolute bottom layer of the most rigid, brutal hierarchy ever invented: chattel slavery.
And the historical record from the Americas reflects exactly how well that went. The sources note that planters and enslavers in the New World quickly realized the Igbo did not take kindly to servitude.
Yeah, I bet.
They were considered highly unpopular purchases because they possessed this unyielding instinct for liberty. They were prone to mutiny, to organizing mass escapes, or to committing suicide rather than submitting to subjugation.
The psychological friction of trying to enslave a kingless people was immense.
Exactly.
Which leads us to an event in 1803 that is so haunting, it blurs the line between historical fact and spiritual legend. The Igbo Landing.
The Igbo Landing.
Yeah.
It took place at Tatum on St. Simon's Island in Georgia. A slave ship arrived carrying a cargo of captive Igbo people.
Okay.
They had survived the Middle Passage, they were brought up on deck, and they were looking at the shores of the American South. They were looking at the reality of the chattel slavery that awaited them.
The source text references Paul Marshall's novel, Praise Song for the Widow, to capture the cultural memory of this moment. And what strikes me is the total absence of panic.
Marshall's description is beautifully tragic.
Yeah.
She writes that upon assessing the situation, they didn't scream, they didn't panic or beg.
They just evaluated it.
They took a good long look. They sized up the world of the enslavers in complete silence. They recognized that physical victory in that moment was impossible. So they turned around, linked arms, and collectively walked back into the waters of the ocean, singing. Marshall writes, "Every last man, woman, and child."
They simply refused the reality being forced upon them.
Yes.
I want to dig into the psychology of that because from a purely Western materialist viewpoint, walking into the ocean is a mass suicide. It's the ultimate defeat. We usually think of resistance as armed rebellion, like grabbing a weapon, fighting the overseer, like Toussaint Louverture in Haiti.
Sure.
But this is a totally different frequency of resistance. It's psychological and spiritual. They essentially opted out of the oppressor's reality.
To understand Igbo Landing, you have to understand the Igbo cosmology. In their worldview, the land of the living and the land of the dead, the realm of the ancestors, are deeply, intimately connected.
Right.
The ocean wasn't just a body of water that drowns you. It was the pathway back home. Walking into the water was an act of corporeal transcendence. It was a spiritual return. They believed that by dying, their spirits would travel back across the water to the Bight of Biafra, returning to the Supreme Being and their ancestors.
So it's the ultimate assertion of autonomy. They are saying to the enslaver, you might have purchased my physical body, but you cannot compel my spirit to participate in your economy.
Precisely that. Death was infinitely preferable to the loss of dignity. And think about how that story functioned as a survival tool for the descendants who remained enslaved.
Right, passing down the legend.
Passing down the legend of the Igbo landing meant preserving the belief that defying the oppressor's reality is always possible. It taught the descendants that the human soul possesses a power that chains cannot hold.
And it wasn't always a silent transcendental escape. We see that same defiant energy manifesting as active rebellion in the Caribbean.
The source text brings up an incredible piece of evidence for that. A Caribbean work song titled The Song of the King of the Igbos. Enslaved workers would sing this while performing a grueling plantation labor. The lyrics are explicitly revolutionary. They sang, "Buckra, in this country, no make we free. What Negro for to do? What Negro for to do? Take force by force, take force by force."
Wow, they are out in the cane fields, under the eye of the overseer, literally singing a strategic directive to take their freedom violently.
Whether it was through the spiritual escape of Igbo landing or the physical rebellion urged in the Caribbean cane fields, they were continually asserting their identity. They were kingless people refusing to be crowned with the chains of slavery.
But here's where we have to fundamentally shift our perspective. We've talked about their immense spiritual power and their defiance of earthly kings.
Yeah.
To really grasp where that inner fortitude comes from, we have to look at the ultimate enforcers of justice in their society.
Yeah.
And the supreme powers in the daily life of the pre-colonial Igbo aren't human politicians. They aren't male warrior gods either. They are female deities.
This is a crucial pivot in understanding their society. In the Igbo pantheon, the supreme being is called Ezekatoki, or Chuku, and Juku is entirely genderless.
So a genderless creator god.
Right. The great god is considered too vast, too infinite, and too remote to be bothered with the petty daily affairs of humans. They are the great force that lives in the sky.
So people don't really interact with Chuku directly.
Exactly. Therefore, the Igbo do not typically build shrines to Chuku. Instead, they direct their daily prayers, their sacrifices, and their legal disputes to the lesser deities, the active, localized forces on Earth.
And these active forces are overwhelmingly dominated by what the authors of our text call the female principle.
Exactly.
We are talking about an entire landscape governed by female goddesses, female natural forces, and female masked spirits. Let's start with the most powerful of them all, the deity who stands right below the supreme being in terms of practical influence, Ani, or Allah, the earth goddess.
Ani is the absolute guardian of morality. She is the supervisor of human ethics. You have to remember that pre-colonial Igbo society is deeply agrarian.
So the soil is everything.
Their entire existence, their wealth, and their survival depend on the fertility of the soil. Therefore, the earth itself is sacred. The very law of the land is called Omanani, which literally translates to that which the goddess Ani decrees to be right or wrong.
Wow.
Every single living person, no matter how wealthy or persuasive they are, submits to her authority.
And the rules she enforces, the taboos known as Ensoani, are not suggestions. They are existential boundaries.
They are strict and unforgiving. Things like murder, adultery, incest, stealing yams from a farm, or even suicide are considered abominations against the earth.
They literally pollute the land.
Exactly. If you commit suicide, for instance, you have offended Ani so deeply that your body cannot be buried within her bowels. You are denied a proper burial in the ground.
Where do they put the body then?
Your body is thrown into the evil forest to rot above ground, and your spirit is doomed to wander as a malevolent ghost. The earth goddess is the ultimate glue of social cohesion. Her supremacy is literally coded into the language. There are common Igbo names like Eniboys, which means the goddess of the land is king.
The earth goddess establishes the baseline of morality. But what I found absolutely mesmerizing in the source material is how specific communities would interact with the divine when they faced unique, localized problems.
Oh, this is fascinating.
If a town needed a new law enforcement body or an economic zoning law, they didn't just pass a bill. A new goddess would descend to establish the order. Here's where it gets really interesting. These goddesses aren't just abstract ideas. They function like local mayors, judges, and zoning boards. It's a highly practical theology, isn't it?
It absolutely is. The book provides incredibly vivid examples of this from the Nasuka division. We can look at the creation of a goddess named Nimukwom of the Obukpa community.
Okay, what was her role?
She functions essentially as a supreme court of justice. Her origin myth states that one day, a terrifying noise like furious thunder was heard from the heavens, and a breathtakingly beautiful woman fell from the sky into a village called Ogwashiujom.
Just fell out of the sky.
Right. She eventually migrated and settled in Obukpa, becoming the revered mother deity of the town. Her primary role is to have the absolute final say on punishments for serious crimes and social disputes.
And she didn't just act in the abstract spiritual realm. She had a literal physical police force.
She had human enforcers known as the Umuada Nimo. These were a dedicated, elevated class of women who acted as the goddess's representatives on Earth. They were deeply revered and widely feared.
What did they actually do?
If there was a dispute involving women that local magistrates couldn't figure out, or if the titled men of the village were deadlocked on an issue, the Umuada Nimo would step in and arbitrate. They physically policed the society on behalf of this female deity.
But the text notes that the Umodanimu eventually pushed their authority too far, right? They ended up clashing with the male spiritual structures.
They did, and it shows the complex checks and balances in the society. In the early 1950s, the Umuada Nimo intentionally viewed a dreaded male masquerade called Onyenweani.
Okay, wait, why is that a big deal?
Well, in this specific tradition, masquerades are highly gendered and extremely dangerous. The masked spirit is considered an actual ancestor returning to the physical realm. Women and uninitiated men are strictly required to retreat when certain powerful masquerades appear. For the Umuada Nimo to stand their ground and view the spirit was a massive violation of custom.
Why is that so dangerous? Is it just about keeping a secret?
It's about maintaining the boundary between the living and the dead. If the uninitiated see the human mechanics behind the mask or disrespect the spirit space, the spiritual contract of the community is broken.
Oh, I see.
After the Umuada Nimo saw the masquerade, they became terrified that the ancestral spirits would kill them for the transgression. So they demanded that the chief priest of the masquerade perform a cleansing ritual to save their lives.
Okay, that makes sense.
When the priest dragged his feet and didn't perform the ritual fast enough, the women resorted to a nuclear option. They went to the priest's compound and camped out there overnight.
To a Western listener, camping on someone's lawn sounds like a mild protest. But in this context, it's a devastating curse.
It is a massive taboo. In their culture, a large group of women camping overnight in a man's compound symbolizes that the man has died and they are gathering for his burial.
Oh, wow. They're essentially declaring him socially and spiritually dead.
Exactly. After terrorizing the priest, they moved their protests to the compound of the local chief's son and camped there. The entire town was so shaken by the gravity of this curse that the titled men, the male leadership, called an emergency meeting.
To figure out what to do with the Umuada Nimo.
Right. They decided that the Umuada Nimo had become too dangerously powerful and completely disbanded them. They stripped them of their enforcement authority. It illustrates that while female spiritual power was immense, it was still engaged in a constant dynamic negotiation with male institutions.
That dynamic negotiation extends right down to the local economy. The goddesses don't just enforce criminal law, they literally explain why certain towns produce certain goods.
Yes.
The story of Ohe, the potter goddess of Nobo, is a perfect example of a myth functioning as an economic charter.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a brilliant piece of practical theology. The community of Nobo is famous for its pottery, but they also have a strict taboo against eating millet. The myth of Ohe explains both.
Okay, tell us the myth.
The story goes that Ohe was the head chief and the mother of the Nobo community. One day, a local woman named Ugin Youngwoke was preparing to make pots. She left her raw clay out in the sun while she went off to grind millet. Because she was distracted by the millet, the clay overdried and was completely ruined.
So the goddess intervenes to improve the manufacturing process.
Ohe steps in, teaches the woman the proper, precise techniques for molding and firing clay pots, establishing the town's primary industry. But as a punishment for allowing the clay to be ruined in the first place, Ohe decrees that the Norobo people are banned from ever eating millet again.
And they still follow that.
To this day, the myth holds. It is considered an abomination for anyone from Nobo to consume millet.
And the zoning laws don't stop there. Ohe's influence extends to the neighboring town, ensuring Orobo keeps a monopoly on the pottery business.
The story continues that Ohe had a friend named Isiika, who was from the neighboring town of Ugbena. One afternoon, Ohe was hosting dignitaries at her house. She had a large batch of newly molded pots drying outside. A sudden rainstorm began.
Uh-oh.
Ohe asked everyone present to help rush the pots indoors before the rain melted them. Everyone scrambled to help, except her friend Isiika. Isiika refused, stating that she was a dignitary and didn't want to get her hands dirty with wet clay.
That is a terrible miscalculation when dealing with a deity.
A fatal miscalculation. An infuriated Ohe turned to her friend and declared a curse. Since Chijioke refused to get her hands dirty to save the pots, from that day forward, anyone from the town of Ugbani who ever attempted to mold a pot would die a sudden and quick death.
And that taboo is still culturally enforced. The text notes that Ugbeni people are strictly forbidden from making pots. They focus on weaving instead.
Right?
And if someone from Ugbani walks past a potter in Nrobo today, the potter will literally make a loud noise like ururu to scare the Ugbeni person away so their cursed presence doesn't cause the firing pots to crack.
Exactly. It's a myth, but it serves a highly practical function. It explains regional trade specialization. Robo is the pottery zone. Ugbin is the weaving zone. The divine decree enforces the economic balance.
It's an incredibly intimate relationship with the divine. These deities aren't distant figures in the clouds. They are right there in the mud, in the markets, and in the family compounds. Which brings us to perhaps the most intimate intervention of all. When a deity descends to solve a deeply personal psychological crisis. I was profoundly moved by the story of Aye Oja of Ugurugu.
The text features a wonderful verbatim interview with an elderly man named Atama Obeda Ogbali. He recounts a story about his father, a man named Ogbali, set back in 1929. His father was involved in a bitter land dispute with a rival.
Okay.
During the argument, the rival hit Ogbali with the ultimate curse. He looked at Ogbali and said, "You are a barren man. When you die, you will have no one to incarnate you."
We have to stress how devastating that insult is. In traditional Igbo society, having a child isn't just a lifestyle choice. It is a spiritual necessity.
It absolutely is.
You need descendants to pour libations for you, to remember your name, and to allow your spirit to reincarnate back into the family line. To be childless is to face spiritual extinction. Your path is closed.
The insult completely broke Ogbali's spirit. He spiraled into total despair. He decided to end his life. He took a heavy rope and walked out to his farm. Crucially, he did this on a day called Nkwo. In the Igbo 4-day market week, Nkwo is a sacred day of rest when farming and heavy labor are strictly forbidden.
He was planning to hang himself on his farm on a sacred day, which, as we discussed with the earth goddess Ani, is a massive, multi-layered abomination. He's polluting the earth with a suicide on a day when the earth is supposed to be resting.
The cosmic stakes are incredibly high. The story goes that Ogbali found a tree, tied the rope, and was literally putting his head into the noose.
And then?
In that exact moment, a woman descended from the sky. It was the goddess Aye Oja. She appeared physically before him and told him that Chukwu, the supreme god, had sent her to cool his temper. She commanded Ogbali to take his head out of the rope immediately.
Wow.
She told him to return to the village square, build a shrine house for her, and sacrifice a cow in her honor.
And in exchange for his service?
She promised him that he would conceive a male child whose name would reign forever. Ogbali did exactly as the goddess instructed. He built the shrine, he made the sacrifice, the child was born.
And the child born from that promise is the very man giving the interview in 1998.
Yes. From that moment on, Aye Oja evolved from a personal savior into a powerful, community-wide fertility spirit in Ogurugu.
It's a beautiful narrative of salvation. We see a society that is completely willing to invent, elevate, or welcome female deities to solve its greatest crises, whether it's the need for a Supreme Court, the need to organize an industry, or the need to save a man from despair.
Right.
But if a society can do that for a single farmer, what happens when the crisis is existential on a massive scale? What happens when a community is completely decimated by slave raids and desperately needs to repopulate? They bend the rules of marriage and gender itself?
That is when they begin to bend the very rules of lineage and gender. In the wake of the transatlantic slave trade and the internal domestic slave raiding that continued long after the Atlantic trade was abolished, many communities in the Nisu area were fragile.
The populations were completely depleted.
Dangerously depleted. To ensure their survival, they created protector spirits, powerful medicinal charms that they elevated to the status of goddesses. A prime example is the goddess Adoro of the Alor Uno community.
And Adora wasn't just a protector who fought off raiders. She functioned legally and socially as a husband.
Yes, the community instituted a radical demographic strategy called Ego Ma Ogo, which translates to becoming the in-law of a deity. Because the town needed dedicated citizens who couldn't be sold or married off to other villages, the female goddess Adoro would marry human women.
Walk us through how that actually works on a practical level. A human woman marries a spirit.
Yes. These women were known as Igburima, or dedicatees. They were essentially ritually enslaved or married to the deity. Once married to Adoro, these women could never marry a free-born human man. They lived in the community, and they were expected to bear children.
But how?
To do this, they would take male lovers from the town, essentially using the men as biological surrogates or sperm donors. But the men had no paternal rights whatsoever. Every single child born to an Igborima belonged entirely to the goddess Adoro.
It's a staggering subversion of patriarchal lineage. By having the goddess act as the legal husband, the community generates a rapidly growing, untouchable class of citizens.
Exactly.
These children belong to the deity, which means they belong strictly to the town. They cannot be trafficked. They cannot move away. The goddess becomes the ultimate matriarch and the literal in-law to countless families.
It highlights a core concept that Western observers often struggle with. In pre-colonial Igbo society, gender and biological sex were not always strictly coupled. Gender was a highly fluid social and ritual construct. A female deity could hold the social role of a husband. Wealthy human women could pay the bride price to marry other women, acting as female husbands to build their own independent lineages. And, perhaps most surprisingly, biological men could become ritual women.
The male priestesses. This is the part of the deep dive that requires us to completely abandon our modern Western frameworks of identity. To serve certain powerful female deities, a male ritual worker must undergo a complete transformation and become a woman.
The underlying philosophy is about cosmic balance. The Igbo strive for an equilibrium of forces. Generally speaking, female deities are served by male priests, and male deities are served by female priestesses.
The opposing energies complement each other.
Exactly. But occasionally, the divine calling requires a different configuration. A male initiate is specifically chosen by the spirits to serve a female deity, and the only way he can interact with her intimately is to culturally and ritually transition into a woman.
The source text doesn't just theorize about this. It includes extensive verbatim interviews with two of these male priestesses conducted in 1998. Let's look deeply at the life of Augustina Tehe.
His background makes his transition even more fascinating.
It really does. He wasn't isolated from the modern world. He was a baptized Christian in 1939. He fought as a soldier in World War II. He had taken the Ozo title, which is the highest, most prestigious title an Igbo man can achieve. Socially and politically, he was the absolute pinnacle of traditional masculinity.
Right.
But then he was called to become the priestess of the river goddess Anunje.
When the interviewer asked Augustine how he manages acting like a woman, Augustine immediately corrected the premise of the question. He was incredibly direct. He stated, "I did not become a woman, I am a woman."
I have to stop you there because I really want to understand the mechanics of this. From a Western biologically deterministic view, or even a modern discourse on gender identity, that statement carries very specific connotations. But you're saying in this mid-20th century Igbo context, he is talking about a ritual occupational reality.
Yeah.
So to put it in modern terms, gender here functions almost like a professional credential or a spiritual uniform. You can be biologically male, socially a husband, politically a king, but ritually a woman all at the same time. How did the community process this overlapping of identities without cognitive dissonance? When he walked down the dirt road, did the other men treat him as a fellow WWII veteran and titled elder, or did they treat him as a woman?
They treated his ritual status with absolute reality. The society compartmentalized his identity based on the context of his duties. His womanhood wasn't a metaphor, it was a daily lived protocol. Augustine dressed exclusively in wrappers tied the way Igbo women tie them knotted at the side, never at the front.
Oh, wow.
He absolutely refused to wear trousers or shorts. When he sat down, he sat with his legs tightly closed, observing female modesty norms, whereas Igbo men traditionally sit with their legs apart.
And his ritual purity is entirely predicated on maintaining this female gender status, which creates some incredibly complex dynamics with his actual human wife.
The taboos he has to observe are fascinating because they reveal how the society views the intersection of sex and ritual energy. Augustine was legally married to a human woman. But if he engaged in heterosexual intercourse with his wife, he was strictly barred from entering the shrine of the goddess Anunje for a specific period.
Why?
Because the physical act of being a biological husband temporarily displaced his ritual womanhood. It brought his male biology to the forefront, and the goddess Anunje demands pure female energy in her sanctuary.
It's like his gender is a spiritual uniform. If he takes off the uniform to act as a biological husband, he loses his security clearance to the shrine.
That's a very apt way to put it.
Yeah.
Furthermore, his human wife actually serves as his ritual assistant. She holds the title of Oboloko. She is one who cooks the food for the deity, supporting her husband's role as the primary priestess.
And the goddess Anunje herself is remarkably strict about who can enter her presence. She hates the color black, viewing it as a symbol of dirt and pollution, and she absolutely forbids any woman who is actively menstruating from coming anywhere near her shrine.
Now, a prohibition against menstruating women is common in many global religious traditions, often rooted in patriarchal ideas of women being unclean. But the analysis in our text offers a much more nuanced, context-specific explanation.
How so?
Anunje is a river goddess, heavily associated with fertility and the birthing process. In this cosmological view, menstruation is not just dirt. It is the shedding of what could have been a human life. It is the termination of a potential pregnancy.
Oh, I see.
Because Anunje is fundamentally a deity of life creation, she must remain completely separated from the biological processes that represent the end of that potential life. She also forbids the eating of okpa, a specific type of bambra nut, in her presence. And she is known as a lethal enforcer. She will reportedly strike adulterers dead if they enter her domain.
Then we have the second interview, which layers even more identities on top of one another. Ijak Omoo Anthony Ize. He is the priestess of Nimirora. This is not a gentle river goddess.
Yeah.
Nimirora is a fierce, expansionist warrior goddess.
Very fierce.
The legends say she fought wars for her people by flooding dry land to drown enemies and striking opposing armies with sudden blindness. Anthony Ize was a young man, only 36 years old when he was interviewed, and he holds the title of Eze, which means he is the traditional king of his community, Adani.
Think about the cognitive gymnastics required to navigate his daily life. He tells the interviewer directly, "I am the Eze of Adani. As Eze, I am male, but as Atama, the priest, I am a woman. I am called Izenwani, queen, even though I am a man."
It's astonishing that the community doesn't short-circuit from the contradictions.
They don't short-circuit because their worldview wasn't obsessed with reducing a human being to a single static biological fact. They understood that a person plays many roles in the cosmic network. Nimirora, the warrior goddess he serves, is equally multifaceted.
Like in her myths.
Yes, in her myths, she often disguises herself as a beautiful, impoverished maiden and wanders the farms during harvest season, begging for yams. If a farmer is stingy and turns her away, she reveals her true nature and curses the farmer with a devastating outbreak of chickenpox.
She is testing their adherence to the social contract of generosity.
Exactly. And she demands absolute, uncompromising equity in all things. When an animal is sacrificed to her at the shrine, the meat is divided. She gets half, and Anthony, as the priestess, gets the other half. But Anthony cannot hoard his share.
He has to share it.
He is spiritually mandated to distribute his half equally to every single person present at the shrine, regardless of whether they are a titled elder or a small child.
Total equity.
She is also fiercely protective of her separation from human reproduction, right? She has a very strict 12-day rule regarding newborn babies.
Yes, Anthony Eze is absolutely forbidden from visiting a house where a baby has been born until the child is exactly 12 days old.
Why 12 days specifically?
In the culture of the Msupa area, a child is not officially named until the 12th day of life. The naming ceremony is what breathes the social and spiritual life force into the infant, transitioning them from a spirit into a human member of the community. Before that 12th day, the baby exists in a dangerous, undefined, liminal state.
And the goddess can't be around that. The goddess Nimirora, as an absolute cosmic force, cannot interact with that chaotic, undefined biological messiness.
So what does this all mean? If we pull all these threads together, we are looking at a society governed by highly decentralized networks. They rely on persuasive speech, they utilize female deities to solve complex social and legal crises, and they actively bend the rules of gender to maintain a cosmic balance.
Right.
But cosmology has to translate into calories. People have to eat. How did this philosophy of balanced complementary power play out in the dirt? How did men and women share economic power in the agricultural fields and the marketplaces before the Europeans arrived and disrupted everything?
Well, to understand the economics, you have to look at the soil. Pre-colonial Igbo life was profoundly agrarian, but the agriculture itself was strictly gendered, and at the center of the male universe was the yam. Yam was the king crop.
The king crop.
It was cultivated exclusively by men, and it was the ultimate measure of a man's worth, his wealth, and his social prestige.
I want to emphasize how labor-intensive yam farming is. You don't just scatter seeds. You have to clear dense brush, build massive earthen mounds by hand, carefully plant the seed yams, and stake the vines as they grow. It requires a staggering amount of caloric output and physical strength.
It is backbreaking work. And because it was so central to male identity, The yam wasn't just a vegetable. It had its own spirit force, known as Ifejioku. A successful yam farmer wasn't just a good agriculturalist. He was someone who had successfully appeased the yam spirit. Men would build vast yam barns to display their harvest, literally showing off their wealth and spiritual favor to the community.
Yam give a man prestige, but you can't survive all year on prestige alone, especially if the yam harvest fails.
That is the crucial caveat. Yam was the king, but the crops that actually sustained the household, that kept the families alive through the lean seasons, the cocoyam, cassava, pumpkins, beans, and maize, were cultivated entirely by women.
So the women are keeping everyone fed.
Absolutely. Women did the weeding of all the farms, they harvested the secondary crops, and they performed all the grueling food processing and daily meal preparation. In many areas, women actually spent far more hours engaged in farm labor than men did. Yet, because of the cultural premium placed on the yam, the women's crops were viewed as subsidiary.
But the women's power didn't reside solely in the farm. Their true domain of absolute control was the marketplace.
The marketplace was the absolute heart of Igbo socialization. It was the center of information exchange, diplomacy, and commerce. And the maintenance, regulation, and spiritual purity of the marketplace were the exclusive responsibility of women.
They ran it completely.
To manage this, women created parallel political organizations that mirrored and checked the male hierarchies. The most prominent of these was the institution of the Omu.
She is often referred to as the queen, but she isn't the king's wife, right?
Not at all. The word Omu essentially means the Neomumu, or the mother of the society. She was the female monarch of the market. She did not derive an ounce of her power from a husband or a male king. She earned her position through her own massive wealth, her trading acumen, and her persuasive character.
She was self-made.
Very much so. She had her own physical palace, her own council of female advisors, and her own distinct insignia of office.
What kind of power did she actually wield? Like, if a man decided to cause trouble in the market, what could she do?
She presided over all women's affairs and completely managed the market economy. She set the prices for goods, dictated the market days, and ensured the spiritual peace of the trading ground. If a man or a woman disturbed the peace, engaged in fraudulent trading, or broke a market taboo, the Omu had the authority to impose heavy fines on them.
And what if they wouldn't pay?
If a man refused to pay her fine, she could deploy the women's networks to socially ostracize him. You also had powerful organizations like the Otu Umoda, which was the Society of the Daughters of the Lineage.
And the Otu Umuada acted as a massive check and balance against male overreach. If the male elders made a political decision that the women felt was disastrous or unjust, the women didn't just write a petition. They took direct action.
They could essentially bring the entire town to a grinding halt. They could go on strike, refusing to cook, refusing to clean, or refusing to engage in sexual relations. In extreme cases, they could gather en masse and publicly shame the offending men, making the town unlivable until the decision was reversed.
Wow.
So, while men held significant overt political authority, the women held the economic and social levers required to veto them.
So you have this incredibly delicate, negotiated balance of power. Men control the yams and the formal assemblies. Women control the sustenance crops, the markets, and the power of the strike. But then comes the 19th century shock.
Right, the British.
The British Empire, having profited massively from the transatlantic slave trade for centuries, officially abolishes it in 1807. And they pivot. They demand that West Africa engage in what they call legitimate commerce. They no longer want human bodies, they want industrial raw materials. Specifically, they develop an insatiable appetite for palm oil.
The British need palm oil to lubricate the newly invented machines of the Industrial Revolution, and they need it to manufacture soap and candles for their booming urban populations. This demand hits the Bight of Biafra like an economic earthquake, and it completely disrupts the gender labor balance because palm oil production is one of the most labor-intensive processes imaginable.
Let's really break down the math and the physical reality of this for the listener, because reading the text blew my mind. To produce just 36 pounds of palm oil, you need to harvest and process 300 pounds of raw palm nuts.
It is an agonizing process. The men's role was dangerous but brief. They would use climbing ropes to scale palm trees that could be 60 feet high and use a machete to hack down the massive, spiky bunches of palm fruit. But once the fruit hit the ground, the rest of the grueling work fell entirely to the women and children.
They have to physically separate hundreds of individual fruits from the spiky stalks. Then they have to boil them in massive iron pots over open fires to soften the flesh. Then they dump the hot fruit into wooden mortars and pound them with heavy pestles to separate the oily pulp from the hard inner nuts. Finally, they have to manually squeeze the sludge to extract the oil.
And that's just for the red palm oil. Later in the 19th century, European demand spiked for the palm kernels, the tiny seeds inside the hard inner nut, which they used for making margarine and animal feed.
So they needed those too.
To get the kernels, the women had to take every single nut, place it on a rock, and smash it with another stone to crack the shell without destroying the kernel inside. It is incredibly tedious, hand-blistering work. One woman, working relentlessly with her children for 3 to 5 days, might manage to produce that 36 pounds of oil.
So if you are an ambitious Igbo man in the 1850s and you want to become wealthy in this new, booming, legitimate economy, you realize very quickly that your bottleneck isn't land. Your bottleneck is labor. You need an army of hands to process the oil.
Which brings us to one of the darkest, most tragic paradoxes of this entire era. The British abolition of the transatlantic slave trade actually caused a massive temporary boom in domestic slavery within Igbo land.
It's the ultimate unintended consequence. It's like an economic whiplash. The British say, stop trading people, start trading oil. But the only way the local economy can produce that much oil overnight is by using the very captive labor the British are trying to stop. It's a perfect storm of unintended consequences. Did this sudden influx of wealth to certain women upset the traditional gender balance?
Well, let's look at the dynamic. Because millions of captives were no longer being marched to the coast and loaded onto European ships, a massive surplus of enslaved people built up within the interior. The local price of a human being plummeted.
Oh, man.
According to the text, a stout male slave could suddenly be purchased for as little as 10 to 12 bags of salt. Wealthy Igbo merchants and titled men who previously acted as middlemen selling humans to Europeans now began buying them up themselves. They used this cheap captive labor to build massive indigenous palm oil plantations.
And because the cultural norm dictated that women were the ones who processed the oil, the demand for female labor absolutely skyrocketed.
Senior men dramatically increased the practice of polygyny, marrying multiple wives, not just for prestige, but as a deliberate economic strategy to secure labor. They also aggressively purchased female domestic slaves. An investment in women was a direct investment in industrial labor and biological reproduction. You see this reflected in Igbo names from the period, like Nuabus, which translates to "a child is wealth." The more hands you had in your compound, the more oil you could produce.
But the men making this calculation missed a critical flaw in their plan. They brought hundreds of thousands of women into the processing pipeline, but they couldn't strip the women of their traditional economic rights.
That is where the women seized their agency. Under traditional Igbo law, the men claimed ownership of the land and the palm trees. Therefore, the men claimed the profits from the red palm oil. However, the hard palm kernels, the ones that had to be cracked individually by hand, were universally recognized as belonging solely to the women who did the cracking.
So when the European demand for palm kernels suddenly exploded in the 1870s, the women were holding a monopoly on a highly lucrative export.
Precisely. Suddenly, countless Igbo women, and even female domestic slaves, found themselves with a significant, entirely independent stream of income. The coastal middlemen coming up from the Niger Delta quickly realized that the women controlled the kernels.
So they bypassed the men.
Completely. They would advance credit and imported goods directly to the wives of prominent producers to guarantee a steady supply of kernels.
It's a massive wealth transfer. Women are using this kernel money to buy their own property, to buy their own freedom if they were enslaved, and to elevate their status in the market. But just as the women are securing this new economic foothold, the geopolitical reality changes again. The British decide they are no longer content to just sit on the coast in their ships and buy oil from middlemen. They want total monopolistic control of the interior. They want the hinterland.
Enter the Royal Niger Company. Between 1886 and 1899, this British mercantile company operated with a royal charter that effectively allowed them to act as a sovereign government over the region. And their business model was ruthless exploitation backed by military force.
They wanted to dictate the price of palm oil, severely underpaying the Igbo producers. And when the Igbo utilized their traditional economic weapon, the trade stoppage, refusing to sell at the lowered prices, the company didn't negotiate. They escalated to extreme violence.
They deployed naval gunboats up the Niger River. The text lists the bombardments. They leveled the town of Abo in 1862 and again in 1893. They bombarded Onitsha in 1879. They attacked Asaba in 1888. This wasn't trade. It was the imposition of imperialism through naval artillery. They literally blew the coastal trading networks to pieces.
And by 1900, the British government revokes the company's charter and officially takes over, declaring the protectorate of southern Nigeria. Now they have to actually govern this massive, dense forest region. But as we discussed at the very beginning, they're looking for a pyramid, and they are faced with a horizontal web. They cannot comprehend a diffuse democracy, and they certainly cannot tolerate the idea of women holding political power like the Omu. So they invent a system out of thin air to force the Igbo to comply with their worldview.
They instituted what became known as the warrant chief system. The British colonial officers would walk into a village, fail to find a king, and so they would simply pick a local man, often someone who was just an opportunistic collaborator or a young man who spoke a few words of English rather than an actual respected elder, and they would hand him a piece of paper called a warrant.
And what did that warrant do?
This piece of paper theoretically made him the absolute autocratic ruler of his community, answering only to the British district officer.
Imagine the absolute outrage. You have a society where leaders are chosen through rigorous debate, achievement, and consensus. Suddenly, a British soldier points to a guy who used to carry his luggage and says, "This is your king now. You pay taxes to him." It is the installation of a bureaucratic patriarchy.
It was a catastrophic disruption. The warrant chiefs, backed by colonial police, often became corrupt tyrants. And the system completely marginalized women. The British ignored the Omu. They ignored the Otu Umwada. Women were systematically stripped of their traditional political voices and their ability to check male authority.
And this political disenfranchisement was happening simultaneously with a massive cultural and spiritual invasion, the arrival of the Christian missionaries. Now, the legacy of the missionaries in Igbo land is deeply complex, and our sources highlight both the salvation they offered and the damage they did. On one hand, for the most marginalized people in the society, the mission compound was a literal sanctuary.
We have to acknowledge that pre-colonial Igbo society, for all its democratic ideals, had severe, brutal exclusions. The missionaries provided refuge for social outcasts, for runaway slaves, and most importantly, for twins.
Right, the taboo against twins.
In Igbo Omenani, the birth of twins was considered a horrific, unnatural abomination against the earth goddess. The belief was that humans should have single births, like higher animals, while multiple births were for dogs or pigs. Twin babies were routinely killed or abandoned in the evil forest, and the mothers were deeply ostracized. The Christian missionaries fought fiercely against this practice.
They saved them.
They took in the mothers, they saved countless infants, and they offered a theology where these outcasts were suddenly valued children of God.
So for an outcast, Christianity is a theology of liberation. But on the other hand, the missionaries brought with them an incredibly rigid Victorian doctrine regarding gender roles. They didn't just want to save souls, they wanted to build a replica of rural England in the African rainforest.
The primary tool for this was education. The missions built schools, but the curriculum was heavily gendered and designed to reinforce a new patriarchal colonial economy. Boys were taught to read and write in English. They were taught mathematics, science, and administration.
Prepping them for government jobs.
They were being explicitly trained to become the clerks, the interpreters, the teachers, and the low-level bureaucrats of the new colonial regime. They were handed the keys to the new power structure.
And what were the girls taught?
The schools for girls, such as the famous boarding school run by Edith Warner at Onitsha, had a completely different focus. They were taught laundry, Western cookery, basic hygiene, and sewing. The explicit goal was to train them to be good Christian wives for the emerging class of educated male clerks. Western education effectively attempted to lock dynamic, economically independent Igbo women into the narrow box of Victorian domesticity.
If we look at the grand sweep of colonialism, there is often a tendency to view the colonized as passive victims, just standing by while their culture is crushed. But if there is one thing we've learned about the Igbo today, it's that they are never passive. They didn't just endure these new colonial tools, they actively weaponized them.
This raises an important question. How did they adapt? The adaptation was staggering. Initially, it was the marginalized, the former slaves and the outcasts, who most zealously embraced Western education and Christianity. They saw it for what it was, a ladder.
A way up.
By learning English and working for the colonial government, they could amass wealth and power that completely bypassed the old traditional hierarchies that had oppressed them.
And when the freeborn, the old elite, saw their former slaves suddenly walking around in suits, wielding the power of the British courts, the panic must have been absolute.
It forced a massive societal pivot. The freeborn Igbo realized that the world had permanently changed. The British weren't leaving. The old ways of securing power were obsolete. If they didn't adapt immediately, they would end up being ruled by their former slaves. So the entire society threw itself into Western education with unmatched intensity. Communities would pool their resources to build schools and send their brightest boys to university in England or America.
They realized that if the British had built a new game board over their land, flipping the board wasn't an option anymore. So they decided to simply master the new rules faster than the British ever anticipated.
This aggressive adaptation is what led to a massive surge in Igbo intellectual, economic, and political dominance in mid-20th century Nigeria. Figures like Nnamdi Azikiwe, who became the first president of an independent Nigeria, emerged directly from this intense push for Western education. The Igbo survived colonialism by aggressively colonizing the colonial institutions themselves.
The British basically installed a bureaucratic patriarchy over a society that used to balance male and female power. But you have figures like Ahibi Ugbabi hacking the colonial mainframe to become a female king. It shows that the Igbo spirit of Onyekwe Chiya Ekwe, your attitude, transcends a sealed fate, survived the colonial courts, right? And even within the oppressive patriarchal warrant chief system, you still have these incredible defiant exceptions. You have women who looked at the colonial mainframe and figured out how to hack it for their own elevation. The source text mentions Omu Okwe of Osomari, who manipulated the colonial trade networks to amass staggering personal wealth and influence. And most astonishingly, the story of Ahibi Ugbabe.
Ahibi Ugbabe's life is a masterclass in exploiting chaos. She was a woman who fled her home as a young girl to escape a forced marriage to a deity. She learned to speak several languages, became a wealthy trader, and allied herself with the invading British forces as a guide and interpreter.
She saw an opening.
She manipulated the British ignorance of local customs and utilized her own immense wealth to get the British to appoint her as a warrant chief.
She became the only female warrant chief in all of colonial Nigeria. In a system designed specifically to elevate men and suppress women, she maneuvered herself into becoming a female king.
It is the ultimate historical proof that the Igbo belief that your sheer determination can transcend even a fate sealed by the gods survived everything. It survived the British gunboats, it survived the Victorian mission schools, and it survived the colonial courts. They took whatever reality was forced upon them and relentlessly reshaped it to ensure their survival.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started in the dense forests of a decentralized, kingless democracy, where power was shared and the ability to persuade was sacred. We followed those people onto the horrifying decks of slave ships, where they crossed the Atlantic and staged acts of ultimate spiritual defiance at Igbo landing, choosing the waters of transcendence over the chains of chattel slavery. We explored a deeply complex cosmology, where the earth itself was a goddess, where female deities solved cosmic and domestic crises, and where biological men willingly transformed into female priestesses to maintain the delicate balance of the universe. We watched as the economic whiplash of the palm oil trade reshaped families, and we saw how the Igbo took the very tools of British imperialism and weaponized them to secure their future in a modern world. They were bent by history, but they absolutely never broke.
But before we conclude this deep dive, there is one last, genuinely mind-bending historical mystery drawn from our sources that we have to share. It's a piece of scholarship that threatens to upend a major pillar of how we understand this history.
Yes. All right, so for centuries, much of what the Western world has known about 18th century Igbo life, the horrors of the Middle Passage, and the early abolitionist movement, comes from a single foundational text. The 1789 autobiography of a man named Olaudah Equiano. He is widely considered the father of Igbo national identity in literature. His book was the ultimate, undeniable proof to the British public that Africans were not savages, but human beings with rich, complex moral cultures.
His narrative was the spearhead of the abolitionist movement. But modern scholars, most notably Vincent Coretta, whose explosive research is heavily featured in our source text, have uncovered compelling circumstantial evidence that calls the entire origin story into question. Coretta suspects that Olaudah Equiano may not have been born in Africa at all.
I remember reading this in the text and being completely floored. If he wasn't born in Africa, where does Coretta think he came from?
Coretta has dug into the archives and found a naval record and a baptismal record, both from before Equiano became famous. On both of these official documents, Equiano's birthplace is listed not as Africa, but as South Carolina. He may have been born into slavery in the American colonies.
But hold on, if he was born in South Carolina, how on earth did he write such an incredibly detailed, vivid account of a traditional Igbo childhood in a village he called Asaka? He describes the customs, the food, the justice system.
Coretta argues that Equiano was a genius synthesizer. As a literate, highly traveled sailor, Equiano interacted with thousands of African-born enslaved people. Coretta suggests he may have relied on secondary sources, gathering oral histories from true Igbo captives, and utilized inherited cultural memory to meticulously invent his African birth.
But why would he lie about something so fundamental? What is the motive for inventing an African childhood?
The motive was entirely political. The British abolitionist movement, led by figures like Thomas Clarkson, desperately needed an authentic African voice. They needed someone who could stand before the British public and say, "I was there, I was stolen from my peaceful village, I survived the Middle Passage." An account from a man born into slavery in South Carolina who had never seen Africa wouldn't carry the same emotional or political shock value.
Oh, wow.
Now, it must be said that other prominent historians like Paul Lovejoy fiercely contest Coretta's theory. Lovejoy maintains Equiano was truly born in Igbo land, arguing that the ethnographic details in the book are too accurate for a non-native to have fabricated.
But just imagine for a second if Coretta is right. If Equiano synthesized those stories and invented his African birth, he didn't just write a memoir. He essentially forged an entire Pan-African identity to fight the Atlantic slave trade.
If true, it would be the ultimate world-changing manifestation of the very Igbo tradition we discussed at the beginning of this deep dive.
The sacredness and power of the speech act. Using mouth. Using words as both a shield and a sword.
Precisely. It would mean he created a narrative so incredibly powerful, so resonant with truth, that he successfully used it to help bring down the greatest, most horrific economic engine of his time.
It changes absolutely everything about how we read history and how we understand the power of a story. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the history you think you know. Keep looking for the horizontal webs where everyone else only sees pyramids. We'll see you next time.